Of course, we can't compromise that God is personal, right? The nun's higher power is not personal. We can't compromise that God is personal, obviously. The doctrine of the Trinity itself shows God to be more personal than most deities would be. So that's not something to be compromised, nor would we want to. Incidentally, the nuns seem to want to have a personal encounter with God if he is indeed personal. They just don't think he is. But my point in all of this is to say that we can actually affirm here, when we look at the Eastern Fathers, the intuition that pushes the nuns in the direction toward the impersonal God. That intuition that pushes them in that direction is the intuition that only a God who acts good is good. That God is not the author of evil, nor can he be. That this means that he can only will the good of creatures and can do no other. That he cannot be a respecter of persons, arbitrarily favoring some or disfavoring others. And even if evils are present and permitted, they must somehow be part of a larger working toward good. Every one of those points can be affirmed by the Eastern Fathers. The only thing that can't be affirmed is the impersonal side of it. But every one of those other intuitions is spot on.
The Christian East and the Christian West share the same creed, the same scriptures, and yet they are worlds apart. The differences run deeper than Mary or icons or liturgy, going to the very nature of God, the hope of salvation, and even what it means to be human. They use the same words, but their meanings could not be more different. As these two worlds collide in our contemporary culture, what's needed is a translator. I spent nearly 2 decades studying these two traditions, devoting myself to figures like Augustine, Aquinas, and the Reformers in the West, but finding myself crossing the threshold of the Eastern Orthodox Church. And now, I'm producing a 25-part lecture series to help bridge this gap, exploring the differences between Eastern and Western Christianity. Pre-order the series now at the lowest price that will ever be offered, or support my efforts by becoming a series producer at theeastwestseries.com. That's theeastwestseries.com.
I'll start with a little anecdote here. I can't remember which foundation it was, Liberty Fund or, something like that. There was some foundation that I was asked to participate in this roundtable discussion for. And at one point in the conversation, I had a long remark, and I prefaced it with a series of apologies, right? I apologize in advance that yada, yada, yada. And somebody told me afterwards, I said, I think that's a record that you managed to apologize 3 times before saying anything. And so I'm going to start in like manner here and offer a string of apologies in advance for things that I'm going to say in this talk. So one is, while I like using the multimedia stuff and it keeps things interesting and breaks up the talk, I don't have much of that today. So it's going to feel longer probably. I apologize. Also, and this is a strange thing to apologize for in this context, it's overtly theological. Maybe I shouldn't apologize for that. But I suppose what I mean is it's likely to get academic and dry, but it is applicable. It's relevant, not academic for academic's sake. And then this is probably the most important one. More often than not, I speak to non-Orthodox people. Okay. I'm accustomed to speaking to scholars who, though they're scholars, know nothing about Orthodoxy, to nuns who maybe know nothing about Orthodoxy, inquirers who know little about Orthodoxy. And so I must confess that I am still unsure what to presume of an Orthodox audience. I don't know what you all know and don't know. And I'm even less sure when it comes to, of course, a gathering of clergy. So there it is. So if my comments feel in some way rudimentary or this is old hat or whatever, forgive me. Hopefully there's still something to be learned nonetheless from this. So with that, Oh, I'll add a fourth apology so I can break my record, my previous record of 3 apologies in advance. I'll give a fourth one. Um, this is probably entirely too long. So if somebody needs to watch the clock and cut me off and say you're out of time, you know, just do so. Okay. Otherwise, I'm just going to keep on going. All right, so there we go. So last night we discussed 4 main features of the nun's worldview, just by way of refresher, since it was a long talk. We talked about this karma, right? Things happen for a reason. We're all connected. This is part of a bigger, more meaningful story. And I heard that somebody actually went and watched Life Itself last night. Look at that. And it was positively reviewed, just in case you're curious. And that story, right, that larger, more meaningful story is just. It is the good is rewarded, evil is punished. Second current we find is that there's this movement toward a higher power, this being an impersonal understanding of deity. And so there is, with that, this underlying distrust of an anthropomorphic God, right? A God who arbitrarily chooses or favors or punishes or rewards. And also with this, the personal experience that God seems to be impersonal because he's not listening, right? He hasn't answered my prayers or shown up or shown me somehow in my experience that he is real. The third current we saw was that there's this conviction that reality is inherently spiritual. So I am a spiritual being. The world is a haunted place. Nature itself has a spiritual dimension that conveys spiritual realities and prompts spiritual feelings. And all of this is, of course, underwritten by this impersonal spirit, right? This higher power that produces it all and ties it all together. And then, of course, we saw the fourth current is the unanswered question, what happens after death, right? This is the troubling part of the worldview, but one of the things that we noticed in here that we talked about was the fact that this is in many ways a reaction against spirituality that is seen as primarily about heaven, right? Spirituality that is all about what happens next, as opposed to what they see as true spirituality, which is here and now. It is therapeutic. It's about bettering myself, helping others, bettering the world, and so on. Okay, so this talk builds on these 4 features. I mentioned yesterday that all the nuns I surveyed, I mentioned this only briefly, but I did mention it, were raised Protestant or Catholic. That wasn't intentional. It's just what happened. I didn't find anybody in any of these surveys who had no religious upbringing. I've met people like that, but they were not in the sample. Nor did I meet, and folks asked if I met any Orthodox, right, nuns. I did not meet any of those. So everyone I happened to survey was raised Protestant or Catholic. And so when they say, religion, I've abandoned religion, I distrust religion, they really mean Christianity as I knew it as a kid. That's pretty much what they mean. They mean my understanding of Protestantism, my understanding of Catholicism. And for me too, this was the case, right? I was raised, my mother was a Missouri Synod Lutheran. My dad, not so much, which again, that was one of those patterns I talked about with nuns, true in my own case as well. So, my understanding of Christianity was based on having been catechized as a Lutheran. And I understand I'm not the only one from the Missouri Synod background who's here. And later, even when I gave myself over entirely to scholarship and looking at matters of religion, I still always looked west, right? So even when I was standing at arm's length away from Christianity, everything I read was, from the Western writers, right? Western scholasticism, whether it's medieval or post-Reformation, Western fathers such as Augustine. And I point this out because most nuns know only Western Christianity. When you say Christianity, that's the only thing. If you brought up Orthodoxy, they think you're talking about Judaism. Or we don't know what this is, right? We just have, it's a blank slate, which I will just say rhetorically, that's actually an advantage. I mean, when you think about rhetoric and engaging people, one of the challenges you have are the presuppositions they bring to the table. As soon as you say, "Oh, I'm not Catholic, I'm Orthodox," and they say, "What is that?" You actually have a moment of blank slate, right? And that's an advantage in when engaging somebody. So I commend that. I commend that differentiation of Orthodoxy in those conversations because it's very useful. But anyway, returning to this, what most nuns knew, what they think of is Western Christianity. What I thought of was Western Christianity. And truthfully, what they've rejected is Western Christianity. What I had rejected was Western Christianity. And I think the rejection of Western Christianity is not without justification. So forgive me. I know that's not very ironic. I know it's not very ecumenical, but nonetheless, I think it is reasonable that there is a movement away from that. And I think it's also reasonable why they embrace in its place, or why I embrace in its place, Eastern Orthodoxy, why it appealed to me, and why other nuns that I've known who have begun to move toward Orthodoxy, it has appealed to them, even though Western Christianity did not. So I don't think this is idiosyncratic. I don't think it's idiosyncratic to me. And so in this talk, I want to look at two things. I want to look at the root areas where Western Christianity has taken fateful turns in its theology that violate the intuitions of the nuns and create such a hurdle for them to get over. And I want to talk about why Eastern Orthodoxy has the potential for unique resonance with these very same nuns. Okay, so one last caveat I'll throw out here. It is very fashionable today, academically speaking, to try to erode or dismiss the East-West divisions and suggest that theologically these are some sort of Slavic invention, and good, careful scholarship should show that that's not really true. There isn't really an East-West divide, and that those who espouse that there is a divide have not really read the primary sources. They're relying on Romanides or something like that, and they should just go read the real sources and see that there is no theological divide. My reply to that is I have read the primary sources. I dedicated years to Augustine, to Aquinas, to Bonaventure, to John Duns Scotus, to Scotus Erigena, and then on into the 16th and 17th century post-Reformation scholastics as well. And I point this out because, as somebody who had dedicated years and years and years to thousands of pages of texts, a primary source on Western theology, the first time I read the Eastern Fathers, I had no idea what I was reading, because it was completely different. Okay. I had never read, incidentally, Vladimir Lossky or Romanides or anything like that. My understanding of a complete divide in the theology was based on nothing but primary sources. So I say that just to say, in case anybody is suspicious, I wonder if he's only read Romanides. Not so. Not so. Okay. So with that, we begin. I want to begin out of all these different aspects of the nun worldview with this distrust in the anthropomorphic deity, and talk about some of the roots for where this comes from and some of those fateful turns I mentioned. So I mentioned yesterday that there is this anxiety about the capricious deity of Christianity, right? One who is impartial or unfair. And by contrast, this is why we need karma or fate. We need a higher power that is impartial, dispassionate, that is fair and just. Now, the fear that God is capricious actually has some legitimate roots in Western Christianity. There's good reason why somebody might suspect this or fear this within a Western Christian context. So to see why, I want to look at the ways that Augustine of Hippo shapes the thinking and the future of Western Christianity, specifically starting with Augustine's system of merits and its development in the Pelagian controversy. Okay, so For those who may be unfamiliar with Augustine's system of merits, it begins by his introduction of this concept of the order of loves, right? So for Augustine, he presumes that we have these affections for different goods. Whenever we encounter a good, there's a certain affection for it. And these affections within us begin to compete because sometimes there are certain goods that we want at the same time, but they're not compatible. For example, easy example, in case anyone has ever thought, it'd be really good for me to go and exercise. And then also thought, but it would also be really good for me to continue to lay on this couch right now. That would be an example of competing goods that are not compatible. And Augustine suggests that whenever we choose, what is happening is a hierarchy of loves, an order of loves, where we are subordinating certain goods to other goods. So every choice reflects this. And now the question becomes, what does the righteous man choose, right? Augustine is here understanding righteousness to be an important feature of what we are to become according to the gospel of Jesus Christ. So what does the just or the righteous man choose? Well, according to Augustine here, working within the Latin, that justitia, you render to each what is due, right? And so what Augustine suggests is that the just man has an order of affections that reflects the nature of the world, the nature of reality. So the ways in which a person may err, for example, is a dog lover could possibly render too much to a dog and too little to a human because they happen to love dogs more than they love humans. A philanthropist, by contrast, may well err by loving humanity, not that that's an error, but by disregarding dogs, not rendering to the dog as much as it is due. But the just man, by contrast, renders to each what is due. His love is perfectly proportionate to the nature of the world. So the hierarchy of the world in terms of its ascending goods, from rocks to plants to dogs to humans and on up into angels, is perfectly reflective of the order of the cosmos itself. And of course, what this means is that love of God is above all else. So Augustine's system of merits is based on this order of love. Just deeds are meritorious before God. Unjust deeds, based on disordered loves, are demeritorious. And what determines whether it is just is not the external character of the act, right? This is where we get into this dynamic where simply doing the deeds of the law do not actually constitute justice, because it's entirely possible that I do something that conforms to the law, but I do so out of disordered loves. For example, we can certainly conceive of somebody being approached with a proposition of adultery, right? And two people who both experience this proposition flee. But one does so because, like righteous Joseph, he fears God, right? Fears and loves God. Whereas the other realizes, well, my wife is vindictive. If she finds out, this could be entirely about self-preservation, have nothing to do with virtue or love of God. And yet the deeds look exactly the same. And this is Augustine's point, is that the implication is that the deed is not about the external character. Its merits are determined by its internal character, the order of loves. That's what determines whether it's just. Now, one of the most formative disputes on Augustine, and therefore on Western thought generally after him, is the Pelagian dispute. And with Pelagius, or miraculously Celestius' disciple, he had begun these teachings had begun to spread that man is a moral island, right? I am neither affected negatively by Adam's sin, nor am I affected positively by Christ's deeds. I am completely insulated and determine my own fate. So this raised a question. What role does grace begin to play in whether we do just or unjust deeds? Now, in the early Augustine, the answer is different than after the Pelagian dispute. So if we look at the early Augustine, Augustine actually suggests that it is entirely within our control to correct our order of love. So should I look within and I find that I have unjust loves, how do I fix that? Augustine tells us, will it. That's it. Will a proper order of loves. But after the Pelagian dispute, specifically once Pelagius started quoting Augustine, Augustine realized I might need to change that. And in doing so, in this battle with Pelagius, what we begin to see is that there's this need for supernatural assistance. Well, it is God who gives grace, and this grace enables a proper order of love. So I make a right use of grace, but without this supernatural assistance, I cannot, in fact, do things that are justly ordered, right? And as the debate went on, to prevent a foothold for Pelagius and the Pelagians, Augustine extended this not just to ordinary deeds for you and I after the fall, but this included Adam and Eden. So what we begin to find here is the birth of the nature-grace divide, right? The nature-grace divide being that nature in itself has no innate capacity for good. It has no natural connection for God. The only way it can ever connect with God is by some sort of supernatural imposition. And this is not only true after the fall, but even before the fall. Now, this creates the background for what becomes the condition of man in Augustinian theology, of course, the doctrine of original sin. That what we have is that the progeny of Adam is stained by Adam's guilt. We are born into the world, we are conceived damnable, because we are born in a state where we have disordered loves, and in addition, Augustine had taught that we had somehow participated in Adam's sin. So we come into the world guilty, we come into the world, which makes us damnable. We come into the world with disordered loves, which means that everything we produce is damnable. And we are ourselves incapable of fixing this order, reordering these loves. So all that we do, whether lawful or not, is sin of necessity. Okay. This is the anthropology that emerges. Now, the ramifications that this has for how God deals with man is where we begin to see the insertion of God dealing arbitrarily with humanity. This is where the root of that possibility comes in. For Augustine, there's three key terms in his lexicon here: justice, mercy, and grace. How Augustine defines justice is that, God, in the case of God, is that he renders to us reward or punishment based on our merits or demerits. In terms of mercy, this would be God's prerogative to perhaps forego punishing us for certain demerits and offer to us the grace that we need in order to fix our order of loves and perhaps produce something that's meritorious. And then grace itself is that supernatural empowerment that flips the order of loves and makes it possible for you to do things pleasing to God. Now, the problem that emerges is that our condition, our condition is one of innate guilt. We are damnable. Our disordered loves, we sin by necessity. We cannot expel or remedy either one of these. And that condition is not of our choosing, but that's irrelevant, according to Augustine, in terms of how God deals with us. So by implication, what we find is that from the moment of conception, God may punish us and damn us for all eternity. And every deed we do, unless God chooses to show mercy and offer grace, compounds that situation, and we only make ourselves more damnable. So the ramifications for God's dealings with man is that, according to justice, God need not offer us anything but hellfire. If God chooses to forego that punishment and offer us some sort of mercy and extend grace, well, then he is praiseworthy for that, right? We should praise him that he has done that. But if he forgoes that and gives us hellfire, he should be praised for that. What this means is that no matter what God does with us, whether he damns us or he shows us mercy, he is to be praised, because at the end of the day, we are owed nothing, period. And this is the introduction of the arbitrary. Whatever God does, it is good. Whatever he does with us, it is good. There is no obligation to be spoken of. Now, this has definitive ramifications for how the West begins to think about God-world relations and how they begin to wrestle through these issues. The medieval scholastics saw this arbitrary ramification, and it was a little unnerving to many of the scholastics. So what you begin to find is you find certain scholastics trying to come up with an explanation of, well, perhaps there are certain deeds prior to grace that would somehow provide the rationale for why God decides to offer some sort of grace at some point in the future and extend mercy. But of course, the response was that cracks the door to Pelagianism, so we can't allow that. So you find this wrestling match going on between certain scholastic schools to try to, on the one hand, prevent God from arbitrarily dealing with man and perhaps providing some rationale for why he shows mercy as opposed to justice, and on the other hand, the fear of Pelagianism pushing back against that. And in the Reformation, of course, that tension falls definitively in favor of God may deal with us arbitrarily. This is, of course, where we get Luther's bondage of the will, which is, of course, the extension of Augustine's necessity of sin, right? That all that we do, because of the disordered loves that we are born into, is of necessity sin. And in Reformed circles, the doctrine of total depravity echoes the same. So the predestination disputes, however, took this matter even further. Augustine, when it came to predestination, he at least offered an interplay, right? That humanity has certain free choices, and there's this dynamic exchange between the foreknowledge of God and the free will of man, his giving of grace and our use of grace, and so on. So he tried to keep it, in some way, a dynamic free interplay that preserves the integrity of human choice. But in Protestantism, the problem is grace can't be, or because the emphasis was grace, right? God forgiving our sins, not because of anything we've done. The idea of giving any credit to the human will was problematic. That needed to be jettisoned. And so as a result, what you find is in Lutheran circles, the answer is single predestination. We're all damnable. And God just chooses, for whatever reason, to save you folks and not you folks, and we should be happy that he saved anybody. Single predestination. In Reformed circles, you begin to see double predestination introduced. God decides you're saved, you're damned, and that's the end of it. Now, the contemporary receptions of this often got worse. Right. So in the 16th, 17th century, the Protestant scholastics were at least more nuanced. They too tried to find ways in order to preserve some integrity to the human freedom and choice. There was a sensitivity to certain blasphemies, right, that you might suggest that God is the author of evil. You can see this, for example, in the dealings with Maccovius, who was a Reformed scholastic who was thought to be teaching just that. But in the 1800s, those nuances disappeared. And the reason was that there was a full embrace that emerged. You see this in people like Hobbes in terms of the philosophical circles, but in theological circles, it happened too with people like Henry Holmes Keynes, and then later with Jonathan Edwards. That there was a full embrace of determinism. Humanity does not have the powers of contrary choice. We are free only in the sense that we do what we want to do. But we have no control over what we want to do. And the reason we want to do what we want to do is because God has made us thus. And who are you, O man, to question God why he has made you thus? And that's where that ultimately lands. In this light, what you can begin to see is why the nuns would fear that perhaps God is arbitrary. No one can lay any claim that God should ever treat them differently, no matter what he does to them. And we have no ability to hold back his hand. We have no ability to remedy our situation. There's nothing we can do to appease him. Whatever he chooses, and that's it. It really is a form of fatalism, ultimately, in terms of where it lands. I want to contrast some of this. Now, I should say, again, I hope this is clear. Not everything I just said there, where this ends up, is something that Augustine himself would affirm, right? So I don't want to suggest that, what Jonathan Edwards, for example, teaches is something that Augustine would be pleased with. There's a critical nuance that ends up being gutted along the way. But there's a reason why, in the midst of the faithful turns of the Pelagian dispute, this begins to grease the skids, as it were, for a movement in this direction. And that over time, historically speaking, that's what becomes the reception. Now, I want to draw a contrast between this way of thinking about God and things we begin to see in the Eastern Church Fathers. Okay? Irenaeus, for example, his case against fatalism, right? It's rather consistent that the Eastern Fathers reject fate as pagan, right? This is something that needs to be pushed against. And Irenaeus's case against fatalism runs roughly like this: if all is fated, then God is the author of evil. If God is the author of evil, then God is not good. And God is good, therefore God is not the author of evil, and the world is not fated. In other words, the commitment to the goodness of God actually becomes the guiding premise that overwrites everything else about fatalism and the worries that might hold for humanity. And this notion that the goodness of God is so certain that it becomes a hermeneutic tool or a hermeneutic principle in how they approach Scripture is something that we can see in other Eastern Fathers as well. Gregory of Nyssa, for example, whenever he's dealing in the Beatitudes or his treatment on the Lord's Prayer, he talks about he considers it blasphemous to attribute to God passions of vengeance and things like this. So when the psalmists begin to talk about smiting, right, the wicked, Gregory of Nyssa suggests that clearly this shouldn't be read in the sense that God is filled with vengeance or passion for vengeance, but rather the desire to see the wicked destroyed is a desire to see them repent so that they may no longer be wicked. If they were to repent, the wicked would be no more, right? Similarly, Cyril of Alexandria, we can see one of the things that when he talks about, for example, why on earth was John, right, the one that Jesus loved? And Cyril, as a hermeneutic principle appealing to Scripture, God is not a respecter of persons. And Cyril's conclusion from this is that clearly it cannot be an arbitrary favoring of John. It must be that John was unique in virtue. There's a resistance here to some sort of capricious dealing with humanity, and an insistence that the goodness of God is always present and active in these principles. Also, contrast Romans 9 is, of course, the key passage in the predestination disputes in the West. And it's fascinating to look at the contrast between how Origen, in his treatise on prayer, begins to talk about Romans 9, which then influences the way the Cappadocians also read these things, in contrast with, say, the Western discussions. So one of the things you begin to see here is that Origen recognizes in these passages about Pharaoh, right, where it's talking about God having mercy on whom he has mercy, and he hardens whom he hardens. Origen throws out, it says, well, I suppose you could try to read this as saying that God forces Pharaoh to sin and then punishes him for sinning. He said, but clearly that would be unjust, so that's not even a possible reading. And he moves on, right? It's just dismissed out of hand as just not even a credible possibility. What is that theme song? Fantastic. I'm also impressed how many people actually know that. That's really a testimony. Okay, so Origen here, as opposed to the sort of what I would call a misguided piety of the West, where there is an insistence that says, hey, if this is how God deals with humanity, we should defend his honor and praise him for it. Origen dismisses out of hand that this would even be a plausible reading of the text simply because we know that God is not that way. He would be evil and unjust if he dealt with humanity in that way. So what's the alternative? And here Origen points out something that becomes pretty common in the way people like Chrysostom and the Cappadocians deal with these sorts of issues. He points out that if the sun, S-U-N, could talk, it could say things like, I caused to grow, and I caused to wither and crack. Right? But it would not be saying that it deals differently with different soil. It would be simply saying that some soil is fit, and when it shines on it, it grows and bears fruit, and some soil is not, and that becomes detrimental to it. And this is how Origen looks at Pharaoh and Moses. God deals with both of them equally. Notice, I think this is such a fascinating feature of this story when you look at it with the Eastern Fathers. God treats Moses and Pharaoh identically. He shows up, he declares who he is, he demonstrates it by a series of miracles, and then he makes a demand. And one of them becomes a saint, and another becomes an object of destruction. He himself is what causes one to flourish and one to wither and crack, not his arbitrary dealings. And this becomes a consistent theme. One of the things that begins to emerge the more we look at the Eastern Fathers on this sort of topic is we find that there is an insistence that God perpetually and continually has a single operation toward creatures, which is for their good. That is the one movement God has toward all things. John of Damascus, in his chapter on providence, writes, "Providence is that will of God," this is a quote, "Providence is that will of God by which all existing things receive suitable guidance through to their end. God alone is by nature good and wise. Consequently, insofar as he is good, he provides, because one who does not provide is not good. Even men and brute beasts naturally provide for their own offspring, and the one that does not will incur blame. Then, in so far as he is wise, he provides for existing things in the very best way." Unquote. Now, there's three things that are particularly noteworthy about this when contrasting many Western patterns of thought with this. Notice first, God acts goodly and wisely because he is good and wise. His operations are an articulation of his nature. They are in no ways arbitrary. Second, John says that were God to not do this, thus, he would incur blame. Now, this is fascinating. He is willing to say, like Irenaeus, that if God operates in this way or that way toward creation, then he is not good. That is something that is abhorrent to so much of Western theology. You cannot say such thing. But for John, hence, if you say that when you say that God is good and wise, you are saying something rather meaningful. He conducts himself this way and not that. And the third, and I think this is very important, a critical contrast between Eastern and Western patterns of thought. John says that providence guides things through to their end. Now, there's clearly some echo of Plato's Timaeus here, which it's not surprising, except that, of course, the Christian God does so freely, and it's not clear that Plato's God does anything but just he's probably closer to the higher power of the nuns. But nonetheless, one of the things that comes through in this sort of statement of John is his presumption that things have a certain nature, and that certain nature has a proper end. An eye has the proper end of seeing, an ear for hearing. And that proper end is the good of a thing. It is not arbitrarily imposed on it from without. It is innate to it, given what it is. And the reason this is critical is that the proper end of man is that man is an icon who, as Gregory of Nazianzus tells us, as icon, his proper end is to ascend to his archetype and participate in it, to participate in God. What this means is that it would be impossible for God to will that man not do that. God cannot will that, given what God is. Again, completely alien to so much of Western theology. Now, the clearest way, one of the places where this comes through clearest, and this is a favorite of mine, is this antecedent consequent will distinction that we find in the Eastern Fathers, specifically in John of Damascus. John of Damascus is the one who develops the terminology of the antecedent consequent will, but it's clearly there in writers, Eastern Fathers before him. John Chrysostom's homilies on Ephesians, for example, you can find it there in his treatment of those passages, albeit without the term. The basic distinction is that antecedently, when we ask, what is the antecedent will of God, we can be assured that any good, insofar as it is good, God wills, and any evil, insofar as it is evil, God repels. We don't need to wonder, right, whether God wills this good or that good. insofar as it's good, he wills it. But the consequent will acknowledges that not every good is compatible with every other good. I gave the example in our human condition of, for example, the good of ease versus the good of exercise. And so the consequent will acknowledges that there is this complex web of how goods and evils and the sorts of providential decisions God must deal with. There's two illustrations that might be helpful here to flesh this out. The one is actually the Pharaoh Moses story that we already mentioned. Um, In the case of Pharaoh, God knowing that Pharaoh is bad soil, to show Pharaoh mercy would actually be for God to not show up. Now, this would not bring about Pharaoh's salvation. It would just mean he's less culpable. And you do find these sorts of things in the Eastern Fathers, though when they ask, for example, well, if Tyre and Sidon would have repented in sackcloth and ashes, why didn't he show up? And one of the speculations is, well, maybe they would have lapsed and they would be in a worse state than the first. So they do think in those sorts of terms. The Eastern Fathers do tend to think in these sorts of terms. Well, less culpability is actually a form of mercy. And that would be mercy in the case of Pharaoh. But at the same time, God wills mercy towards his people, and they are captive toward Pharaoh. So at this point, God willing mercy toward Pharaoh and towards his people and the redemption of humanity must choose between competing goods, right? The good of showing mercy toward Pharaoh versus the good of liberating his people. And of course, we know what he chooses because those goods are not compatible. He chooses to liberate his people, even if it means Pharaoh's destruction. Second is a more personal example. If you were to stand with me and my family during evening prayers, you would hear mention during the prayers of someone named Noah when we got to the prayers for the dead. And if you were asked my children who's Noah, they'd say he's my brother. He is, we miscarried Noah, my wife and I. And this was around the time when a month later, if you also met my son David, you would find out that basically what happened was that Noah miscarried, and a month later, David was conceived. Okay. And the reason, incidentally, we call him Noah is because he introduced himself to my wife in a dream, which is something Chrysostom talks about children, deceased children doing in one of his letters. Sorry, that's an emotional thing right there. Now, one of the things that I think is fascinating here is that I can conceive of three scenarios. The one scenario is a scenario where the evil of Noah's miscarriage is somehow prevented miraculously. God intervenes, and Noah makes his way to term. In that scenario, David never comes into existence. A second scenario is that God forgoes the pain of a miscarriage and the evil of that miscarriage, but permits the conception of David, right? But then in that case, Noah doesn't exist because, of course, projecting forward, Noah still exists, right? Even if not in his body. The only scenario in which Noah and David both exist is this one. The one in which Noah's miscarriage is permitted and then David is conceived. And so if I ask myself, not that I think it's a safe litmus test to say, well, if I were God, never a safe question. Maybe there's nothing dangerous about it. It's just probably stupid. But considering those three scenarios, I can't help but agree that this would be the best scenario, right? That this would be the good I would will, even though you have this evil that attaches to it. That, in essence, is what you have in this antecedent consequent will. And the point is basically, as John of Damascus fleshes this out, as Chrysostom fleshed this out before him, is that God can will nothing but the good of a creature, right? And so even when we find the permittings of evil, that is part of a complex of willing the good of all creatures. Now, the reason I point this out is because Of course, we can't compromise that God is personal, right? The nun's higher power is not personal. We can't compromise that God is personal, obviously. The doctrine of the Trinity itself shows God to be more personal than most deities would be. And yet, so that's not something to be compromised, nor would we want to. Incidentally, the nuns seem to want to have a personal encounter with God if he is indeed personal. They just don't think he is. But my point in all of this is to say that we can actually affirm here, when we look at the Eastern Fathers, the intuition that pushes the nuns in the direction toward the impersonal God. That intuition that pushes them in that direction is the intuition that only a God who acts good is good. That God is not the author of evil, nor can he be. That this means that he can only will the good of creatures and can do no other. That he cannot be a respecter of persons, arbitrarily favoring some or disfavoring others. And even if evils are present and permitted, they must somehow be part of a larger working toward good. Every one of those points can be affirmed by the Eastern Fathers. The only thing that can't be affirmed is the impersonal side of it. But every one of those other intuitions is spot on. Now, of course, we do also have to affirm that God is not just personable, but free, right? However, again, going back to John of Damascus and others, God's freedom is always a free articulation of who he is, right? These articulations are never arbitrary or in some way contrary to his wisdom or goodness. So in this way, his wisdom and goodness and all that has been said about that serves as an assurance that however God freely exercises, freely operates, it is always in a way that in no way should set any of these intuitions on edge, right? Okay. Um, Pardon me while I take a small sip of coffee here. Okay, so I want to transition now to this other intuition that the nuns share, which is that our world is somehow spiritual. And as we saw, there are a lot of dynamics to this. I'm spiritual, the world's spiritual, nature has spiritual dimensions, there are spirits in it, there are haunted places, etc., right? There's lots of dynamics here. And as we'll see, these dynamics begin to sort of pan out as we work through this. All right. This intuition that the nuns have, I think, collides with two aspects of the Augustinian anthropology. And the first is the nature grade and grace divide itself. There's something that seems inherently pessimistic about that sort of a divide. It has a pessimistic view of nature, that it has no innate or natural capacity in terms of connection with God, or no innate spiritual intersection with God. And the second, of course, is the anthropology itself, that we are born damnable. This is, of course, something that Augustine went to great lengths to make clear his stance on, so much so that it scandalized even the medievals. And when medieval scholastics sit around going, boy, I think that might be too harsh, you may have crossed a certain line. I remember being shocked when I read in his, I think it's on The Gift of Perseverance, when he made the point of saying, even if parents are racing to get their dying infant to the priest to have it baptized and it dies on the way, it goes to hell because God could have preserved it long enough to be baptized. My thought was, not everything you think you have to write down. Some things are better left unsaid. Anyway, and of course that's just infants, and of course we can also point to Augustine's Confessions, where he talks about the prideful, angry, self-centered, egotistic infant that's demanding its mother's breast. How dare it? Okay, and then with this also, of course, all that we do is damnable sin. even when it's in keeping with the moral law. So there really is no good that humanity ever does without some sort of supernatural assistance. And of course, even in a pre-fallen state, that's true. So the result you have is this diametrically opposed worldview between the nun's intuitions, right, which is more of an optimistic view of nature, having innate connections and hope and possibility of participating in God, and their similarly their anthropology with regard to themselves and humanity being innately spiritual, and what we find in Augustine. Now, I think there's reason to think that the Eastern Orthodox instincts, Eastern Church Fathers in particular, are more in keeping with the nuns' optimism on some of these things than with the pessimism. And of course, we could do simple things like just contrasting the view of infants, right? Contrast Gregory of Nyssa's on infant death, where when asked if infants are damned, of course they're not damned. They're not even moral agents. Why on earth would you ask such a question? With Augustine, but I think there's more substantial contrast to be drawn here. One of the things that we find in the Eastern Fathers is that our hope of participation in God is part of our very nature as human beings. Central here is the idea that we are an icon of God. That we, being this icon, have an innate connection or innate possibility of ascending to the archetype. Gregory of Nyssa talks about this way, right? The mixing of the supermundane with, the earthly and so on, where he's talking about the hope of ascending to the archetype. And Basil too talks about how Basil of Caesarea talks about how no one needs to teach the soul to love the good. Right, and goes on and is rather insistent. That's innate in the soul. The soul already does love the good and pursues the good. It could not be taught to do so. And similarly, even Chrysostom, with the way he talks about conscience, Chrysostom actually talks about the conscience being inspired by God, and here using the same verbs that he uses when talking about the prophets being inspired by the Holy Spirit. These are natural, not supernatural connections that we as humans have with God simply by virtue of being humans, how he has made us. Now, in the fall, of course, we do have something occurs, something tragic occurs, but it's not the forfeiting of a supernatural grace in the way the Eastern Fathers describe it. Instead, they describe a burying or a disordering or a tarnishing of something that's there. So we see this, for example, in the way Gregory of Nyssa will use the lost coin parable as a description of that icon that has been buried and lost in the house. And the goal is to actually clean the house in order to find that so that we can celebrate and bring it again to the surface. It is not the pleading for some sort of external supernatural grace to break in, but the restoration of the house that is fallen and disordered. And with this, we begin to find that this core icon, it can always be buried, it can be tarnished, but it can never be destroyed. Right? There's this root optimism that no matter what we do, we can't actually obliterate that icon of God that is within. And of course, in the incarnation, what we see is that this is the way the Eastern Fathers talk about this. This is not, of course, primarily about appeasing some vengeful deity, right, who we have angered. Instead, it is about restoring humanity, restoring the disordered nature, again, vivifying it, right, finding that lost coin, unmaking and remaking man, putting things back right again. So all of this, I think, testifies to a certain optimistic anthropology. Man has a spiritual nature that is indeed innate. His hope of participating in God is based on that nature. And though it may be disordered, it can never be destroyed. And that's why it can be set right by God, which is what the work of Christ is. This is a sort of complex web of optimism I tried to actually capture at the close of Becoming Truly Human. That's my one multimedia clip I have here. So if somebody could hit the lights, I'll share that one bit of the film. So this is the last scene of the movie. As I said at the outset, I'm not whole. I'm far from uncorrupted, and I'm certainly no saint. Becoming Orthodox didn't change that. Adopting Baudrillard didn't propel me or my family to sainthood. The writers who led me east taught me that there's no hope of becoming what we desire without a long road of struggle, an imitation of the suffering of God. So, this is the path to which my journey has led me. Yet neither this path nor this version of me is my destination. For when I arrive there, so in that scene, which is really meant to be sort of a capture, a picture of the entire film, what you begin to see is this sort of dynamism of, on the one hand, the tragedy of the fallenness of humanity, right? That we are not what we ought to be. And yet that innate potential that is there, that any one of those people on that street has the potential to be a saint, right? Who we venerate their icon in our church. Um, and and all the dynamics that go with that, the tension between the image which is there and the likeness that needs to be obtained. Now, I think one of the things that's also needs to be recognized with this is it's one thing to talk about humanity and the potential that humanity has in terms of participation in God, but one of the things that's so extraordinary to my mind, especially when considering so many of the things that the nuns are drawn toward, is the extent to which this anthropology, right, that the Eastern Fathers have extends to their cosmology. So we can see this specifically when the Eastern Fathers begin to talk about man as microcosm, right? Uh, this is a doctrine that offers a tremendous connection or potential connection, again, with the nuns in terms of their spiritual sense about nature. Um, in I mean, perhaps again, perhaps everybody here is familiar with this doctrine and what it ultimately means. Uh, Essentially, what we begin to see is that with the Eastern Fathers, they recognize that, what would philosophers later call the great chain of being, right? That the structure of the cosmos tends to be divided into two types of things. You have these things that are composed of organic gross matter, right? that decompose, right? That go through generation and decomposition, and then you have these things that are, relatively speaking, immortal, right? Invisible, non-organic spirit beings, right? Things like angels. And what we find is that in humanity, you see these two halves of the cosmos joined, right? Humanity is composed from the dust of the earth, and here takes on a body that he shares with the organisms, right? The dissoluble creatures of the earth. And then God breathes into man and makes him a living spirit. And here, what we begin to see is we see this microcosm where the whole of what God has made has somehow been joined together in a single entity, one creature, that when you look at that creature, you see all that God has made joined together. It's a microcosm for the whole. And one of the things that's interesting when we look at this doctrine and the fact that man is this composite, right, this joining of the two halves of the cosmos, is a question that some of the Eastern Fathers begin to raise, is the question of, well, was man made mortal or was he made immortal? And the answer typically actually draws on Philo of Alexandria's response. And this response, drawing on Philo, actually is rather consistent, going all the way back to Theophilus of Antioch, and then it continues to echo in Nemesius of Emesa and Cyril of Alexandria. And the answer they offer is that man was created neither. He's neither mortal nor immortal. He was potentially mortal and potentially immortal. Essentially, man was created at this hinge point, right, this fulcrum where he could move either towards the lower things of creation and embrace his mortality, or move toward the immortal things and raise up his lower nature. Now, it's that last part that is particularly important here. Key to understand in this is that this is not primarily just about man and what man could become. The idea of man raising up his own lower nature is actually hope of raising up the lower parts of nature with him generally. Man becomes the hope for the lower things of nature to begin to participate in God to a greater degree, more fully. An analogy here might help. If we had Bach, right? We had reanimated Bach, and Johann Sebastian Bach is here with us. And we began to talk about this depth of creativity and this creative genius that Bach has. That would be a very abstract way of talking about it. But what we could do is we could begin to hand Bach instruments. And as Bach begins to play those instruments, what we see is articulations of that creative genius. Now, one of the things that inevitably happens is that certain instruments have a greater degree of participating in that creative genius than others. Clearly, if we handed him a triangle, right, he can't do much with that. Now, he might be able to do a lot more than you or I, and we might be very impressed with what he does with it. But nonetheless, it's still just a triangle. And yet contrast that with, say, a ukulele or a piano or something like that, we begin to see these greater degrees of capacity for participation in the creative genius of Bach. And yet, when you hand Bach an orchestra, now what you begin to see is that even the triangle can participate more fully in the creative genius of Bach. And this is perhaps one way of illustrating what this looks like, to say that the lower things of creation can begin to participate in God more fully as a result of humanity as microcosm participating in God. A plant certainly participates in God insofar as it's been created by God, right? It's an articulation of God's creativity, of his nature, of his wisdom, and so on. But it doesn't participate in the same degree as an angel. And yet, somehow, when you have man, which is the orchestra, where all of these things are brought together, even the lower things have the potential to begin to participate more fully in God. So one of the things we begin to see here is that in this microcosm doctrine, every creature is actually created to participate in God. Nature itself is supposed to ultimately, when things are set right, nature itself is supposed to participate in God, not just man and not just angels, not just the rational things, but rather the lower things as well. And that's the very purpose of you and I. That's what we offer to the cosmos. Um, Now, I've said something about participation here, and I should probably say a bit more about what's meant by participation. Obviously, here we run into the key element of the essence energies distinction that everyone I'm sure is very familiar with, but permit me to rehearse it because it's so critical to what all of this means. So, the term energies, of course, is from Aristotle. This is a term that Aristotle develops, distinguishing, say, a power from its use initially, say, the capacity of sight versus his active seeing. And then in his cosmological argument, he begins to develop it more fully, distinguishing perfect action from imperfect action, kinesis versus energia. And here, a simple example would be something like the difference between, say, building, where you move through successive stages and it's incomplete until you arrive at the end, versus, say, seeing, where it's complete at every given moment. I'm not starting to see, I am seeing, right? And this becomes critical to how he describes God, who acts perfectly and not in these sort of imperfect sequential sort of operations. Now, this, of course, gets picked up in the Alexandrian Jews, Philo in particular, but not just Philo. And but Philo is the one who draws the critical distinction between the essence of God and God's energies. And this is where he uses this to interpret the distinction, the biblical distinction between God's face and God's back. What God is, his essence, his face, no man can see and live. But his operations or his operative power, they come down to the cosmos. And that is the back of God that we can begin to see. Um, our Bach metaphor would again be helpful, right? When we talk about the creative genius of Bach, it's this creative depth that is very abstract. And what it means to say that Bach has this creative genius, well, again, what does that mean? It's very vague, but it becomes very clearly articulated when you give him piano, right? And so in the same ways, what God is, the mind cannot grasp, right? He's above the sorts of things that the mind deals in. But nonetheless, as God begins to act, create, interact with the world and providence, we begin to get some glimpse of who and what God is. Now, the second development, of course, that happened with the Alexandrian Jews, which was particularly useful for New Testament Christianity, was the idea that the energies are not just an activity, but they are a reservoir of power that can be communicated to another. Right, so this is where we begin to see the energies used as a way of explaining demoniacs or prophets, the Maccabees using them in reference to even the good angels. So it's not just bad angels that can energize. And of course, the favored metaphor to explain this is the fire metal analogy that the Eastern Fathers so often use to talk about the way metal can begin to participate in fire, right? Fire begins to communicate its heating and lighting properties to metal. The metal remains fire, but the operative powers of fire have somehow taken up residence within it. And it has become a conduit. And both of these concepts begin to appear in the New Testament. St. Paul speaks of being energized by God, of Peter being energized by God. He talks about the children of wrath being energized by the devil. And of course, then critical to the soteriology, right, of the New Testament is the idea that we partake of the divine nature, right? This is how we put off corruption. And of course, then Paul links the putting off of corruption for incorruption with resurrection itself. So what we find in the New Testament then is that the hope of immortality, right, the hope of becoming holy, the hope of resurrection, the hope of becoming incorruptible is not merely an act of divine fiat, right? It is something that comes to us by participating in God himself. We participate in God's immortality. In that way, we taste immortality. We participate in God's holiness, and in that way, we become holy. We participate in God's incorruption, and in that way, put off our corruption. And this is, of course, the doctrine of deification in the Eastern Fathers. Now, the reason I flesh this out is because I think it's critical to recognize that one of the things that begins to emerge here in this way of thinking, right, is that the view of the world and of creatures is a porous one. In the West, there emerges this tendency, and here I don't just mean Western Christianity, but certainly in the Enlightenment, a tendency to think in mechanical terms about the world and causation. Right, you and I, creatures, are closed systems. Right, when things are acted on or causally acted on, they are acted on from without. But once you begin to introduce this concept of some sort of participation via communication, right? A porous participation in a foreign nature, right? The way, say, the fire metal analogy discusses. What you begin to find is this idea that there is a different type of mode of interaction that begins to emerge. The notion of conduit, right? The notion of God acting in and through a thing, as opposed to just externally acting upon it. And the reason this is important is because this porous nature of reality, right, this idea that we can somehow participate in God, is not limited just to souls or spirits. As we see in the microcosm doctrine and in the doctrine of resurrection in particular, our flesh is supposed to participate in it, not just our souls. Our flesh is supposed to participate in God. And through man, the lower things of creation are supposed to participate in God. Nature itself is supposed to participate in God. Irrational material can participate in God. Icons begin to exude things like myrrh and become conduits for grace. And we see foretastes of this even in the Old Testament, where Moses, when the tabernacle is being built, these artifacts are created, and anybody can handle them, and they're these beautiful artifacts, but then they're laid out and they're blessed. This probably seems familiar to us. They're blessed, and then God descends, the glory of God descends and touches them, and now they are holy and can only be handled in a certain way. They're no longer common artifacts, they are sacred. The fact that they are sacred is not just a functional or a structural reality, it's an ontological reality. They have come to participate in God in some measure because God has touched them. And so it is that carries over in all that we do in terms of the icons, and the parish itself even. Now, the reason I think this is so important is because once we look at this, we begin to see that the intuition that says that humans are inherently spiritual. The world is spiritual. This world is filled with spirits. Those spirits can infect a place, right? They can infect an object. That there is some sort of rippling that happens based on how we live spiritually throughout the world. All of that is affirmed in these doctrines. The difference is the Eastern Fathers have done a much more thorough and clear and truthful way of fleshing out exactly what that means. There's not here so much a need to correct the nuns as to inform them what they are intuiting, because it's something that's pervasive in the cosmology of the Eastern Fathers. This is how they see the world. Now, I certainly do not mean to suggest that the Orthodox, or that the nuns have an Orthodox worldview. Obviously, is a sort of secular mishmash of following intuitions. They're ships at sea trying to sort through certain spiritual intuitions or aesthetic intuitions or moral intuitions they have. But what I do mean to suggest is that these aspects of what the Eastern Fathers teach have such a great deal of resonance with the nuns and what they intuit about the world, that Orthodoxy has a tremendous amount to affirm in their worldview and in their instincts, and a tremendous number of connecting points that can be affirmed and agreed with. Now, all of these connections, and I know I'm going long here, they point to one last thing that I want to talk about. I mentioned that for the nuns, true spirituality is therapeutic. It's not about fire insurance. And of course, the doctrine of deification completely affirms that, right? The understanding of the fall as somehow a corrupting of our nature, the understanding of the incarnation as a remedying or a healing of our nature, and the understanding of the Christian life as a lifelong entering into and participation into this therapeutic restoration of humanity is something that is writ large across Eastern Orthodoxy. But notice that when I mentioned that that the nuns are inclined to think spirituality is therapeutic, this came in the context of the big question of what happens after death. Now, the reason is because they're unsure, right, what happens after death, and that's the reason why spirituality has to be about the here and now, because that's the only thing they're sure of, right, is this world and spirituality of this world. But here's where Orthodoxy can offer a helpful remedy amid its affirmations. The nuns are working with a false dichotomy about the therapeutic versus the afterlife. It's because they've grown accustomed to what is typically in Christianity as they know it, a stark dividing line between life and death that marks the here and now from future judgment. Whereas what we can actually offer is a way of affirming the therapeutic, right, while also at the same time suggesting that the remedying and the therapeutic and the healing of man is something that extends in a fluid, smooth motion from this life into the next. That the return of the body to dust is part of the therapeutic unmaking and remaking of man. That the souls of the saints are still part of the spiritual nexus of our world, right? They haven't sort of checked out and gone somewhere else completely, where they have nothing to do with our world anymore. They are still part of that spiritual fabric, and that there's this continuity all the way into the resurrection with the restoration of the body itself. Um, I want to mention here an area where I think, and this is sort of me ramping into my closing here. I mentioned the problem of divine hiddenness being a key aspect of one of the things the nuns stumble over. And I want to use the things that have been said here to offer what I think would be a fair Orthodox response to the problem of divine hiddenness. One, as far as I know, is not offered in the philosophical literature right now. I want to start with this observation about Scripture. If we think for a moment, how many times in Scripture does God the Father show up and act directly? Without an angel, not through the Son, not through a saint, not through a prophet. It's hard to think of instances. I could think of two, right? The theophany and the transfiguration, right? He speaks, "This is my Son." Those are some of the two more obvious ones. But one of the things we begin to see is that whenever God acts, he always acts through, it seems normative that what God does is God acts in and through prophets, right? God heals, but God heals through the prophet. Right? God speaks, but God speaks through the prophet. God judges, right? But it's through fire, right? Or it's through water, or whatever it may be. And taking this mechanical worldview that I mentioned, there's a tendency, I think, because of that mechanical worldview, that when we think, where is God, to look for God in between things, in the negative space, right? Because that's the only room left for God. If God shows up, he should show up as an actor on the stage here. Whereas once we've begun to think in this way about a porous world in which God can act, energize in and through, where you have conduits, what opens up is the possibility that God can be present in the world, not between things, but in things, in the conduits. And what this opens up is the possibility that for many who are troubled by divine hiddenness, they may be just looking for God in the wrong places. They're waiting for God to show up in between things. And yet, I can't help but imagine that were I sitting with Elder Paisius, for example, and he began to tell me secrets about myself, right, that God would seem very hidden at that moment. And yet, God would not be an actor on the stage. He would be present in and through Elder Paisius. And I don't mean merely as a sent agent, right? Again, this is the sort of mechanical tendency to think, well, I suppose if God acts through somebody, that means he sends them like a servant to go do something. I mean something much more profound in the sense of the conduit notion of like a branding iron, right? Where you take a branding iron, you brand something, and both the metal, the shape of the metal has contributed to the act, and the fire is in the metal contributing to the act. Both are present, right? This is synergy, right? The two energies that are converging together in a single act, right? Or we could think of John of Damascus's inflamed blade, right? That cuts and burns at the same time. Given the way that the Eastern Fathers teach us the way the world is, that it is porous, right? That God energizes not just you and me, but that other things are supposed to participate as well. I can't help but think that the remedy of divine hiddenness is to encounter the holy in the world. Not in between the world, but in the world. And for that reason, we can pretty easily diagnose why God is hidden. I don't need to think very long or hard to figure out why God seems to be more present in St. Mary of Egypt than in me. I pretty much tell my confessor every time I go to him why Saint God is more present in St. Mary of Egypt than me. There's no wonder to that. In this light, I think the remedy of divine hiddenness, and this goes to a practical application, which is what I want to close with. The remedy to divine hiddenness in our own lives is repentance, that participation in the restoration. But it's also the looking to the lives of saints, which provide testimony of where God has been in and through the world. Most obvious. It's in the spiritual pilgrimages to places where we know that God is active, say to a mirror streaming icon, or to a monastery to meet a holy person. These are the places where we can go and find the clearest conduits that serve as a possible remedy to the question of divine hiddenness, because God is not as hidden there. And this is the practical point that I would end with. All of this may be useful in terms of talking about the worldview of the nun and going through the head, but I'd mentioned that the nuns are very much about intuitions. And this is where the practical reality of Orthodoxy, that it is lived and that it is practiced, that its holiness is sensed in by going into the actual liturgy and participating in the life of the church, is critical. I think one of the great advantages that Orthodoxy has with the nuns is not just the worldview, which offers much by way of affirmation of their intuitions once the conversation begins, but even without the conversation or prior to it, the life of Orthodoxy is something that has a great deal of potential in terms of tapping into their aesthetic intuitions, their moral intuitions, and their intuitions about the world and the possibility that people and places and things can all be conduits for spiritual realities. Okay. I'll talk more about some of the practical applications of that in the next talk, but that's it.
All right. Hi. Thank you very much. As you were talking about, all of the laying out very clearly and nicely the distinctions between the traditions of Eastern Christianity and Western Christianity, I was reminded of long conversations I had as a college student with a friend who was a very committed Roman Catholic and very committed to a lot of those things that you just laid out as, to our eyes being very strange and unjust. And when I tried to point that out to him and say, look, don't you realize that this God that you're describing seems kind of unjust and capricious? He says, well, that's just because you're believing your own intuitions and your own ways of thinking. And you're not, right, you're leaning on your own understanding, right? And you're not. So I mean, I answered something back then, and I've thought a lot about it since then and have some of my own ideas, but I wonder what you would say to that.
Well, I'll tell you what I would say if you told me what you would say. it's not so much. I'm hesitant to say, what I would say, as much as to say offer a bit of a diagnosis of what I think the challenge is there. So I think the challenge is that there are a great many good-hearted people who love God. They are drawn to God, and they have become convinced that Christianity, right? That's where I find God. And if they're honest with themselves, there are aspects of it that make them very uneasy, right? Aspects of its doctrine that make them uneasy. Certain things that seem unjust or a little bit crazy, but they have this sense that it would be impious to say that. It would be an indictment of God. It would be moving toward apostasy because I would just be giving into my depraved notions of justice and injustice, and I need to just entrust myself to God. Who am I, oh man, to talk back to God? And I think the real challenge there is that there is a certain fear of impiety, and that's where you get a somewhat misguided piety, as if saying that God can torture infants for fun and I will praise his name anyway would be is a pious thing to say, whereas I think the Eastern Fathers would probably tell you that's just blasphemy, right? You shouldn't you shouldn't suggest that God might torture infants for fun. Um, and so the great divide that I think that emerges here, and this is something that I've encountered in Reformed circles, especially, is one area where I would think you begin to see it is that there's a celebration of a bold piety that says, I'm willing to defend the honor of God no matter what he does. And that's associated with piety. And there's a suspicion of, as you said, your intuition, specifically moral intuitions, your mere human sense of moral right and wrong. Whereas I think that is the great divide there, because from what I can tell, the Eastern Fathers want to suggest that conscience actually is a gift from God, right? Your moral intuitions do have a supernatural origin to them. Now, they can be distorted, right? They can be clouded, they can be darkened. And so it's not as if we want to take them, divorced from scripture or from piety or anything like that. But there is a trust that if you sit there and say, this strikes me as wildly immoral, perhaps I'm misunderstanding God's activities here. That's something to be taken seriously. Whereas I think in the Reform circles, that's something to be, that the only way to deal with that is to say, well, that's just suspect because it's your own human. So there's been this practice of suppressing that way of thinking, suppressing those moral intuitions. And I think that's a big hurdle. Now, I think my inclination is to suggest that the best way to overcome that is to help them realize that there's a Christianity that precedes their Christianity that did not try to suppress those things and was willing to say the sorts of things that much more than what I outlined, but some of the things that I outlined here. And for many of them, I think that becomes a relief, right? Because there is this gnawing inside of saying, I don't want to blaspheme God. I don't want to indict God. But there is something that internally, if I'm honest with myself, I'm uneasy with about what's being taught here.
Exactly to that point, in the videos that you showed last night,
Mm-hmm.
I noticed in your videography you several times cut away from looking at the young people's faces,
Mm-hmm.
and you focused on their hands.
Mm-hmm.
And I saw them wringing their hands as they talked about difficult subjects. What gave rise to that anxiety
Mm-hmm.
that was clearly evident there?
Mm-hmm.
Could you just speak to that? Is that along the same lines of this fear of enmity which you're talking about now?
It's tough for me to say exactly what's going on there. Because obviously some of it could be just that you're on camera, right? That's already stressful itself when there's a massive camera crew working around you, and this is going to go live. But I do think you start to see certain patterns that emerge. Certain people who you can tell they have an aversion to being challenged, right? So whenever somebody speaks up and contradicts, you start to see the fidgeting or the shifting eyes because there's a discomfort with that. And so the reason cutaways are also useful in terms of editing. There's a practical reason for that too. But I will say that I do think the body language was telling with regard to how anxious or not a lot of those folks were. And you could tell which ones were a little more comfortable in their skin and where they were at, and which ones were much more uneasy with where they're at in their journey. I think that came through in some of the body language.
I haven't seen the full film yet, Becoming Fully Human. So what I saw last night, no one ever mentioned Christ in any way. They talked about Christianity, never Jesus or Christ.
Hmm.
Anything in the film maybe about, do they react to who Jesus is or something about Christ? And how would they handle the scandal of the cross, do you think? You read down to the cross and suffering, the suffering God.
Yeah. So I think the answer is so no, Jesus never came up in any of the conversations, as shocking as that might be. Now that's probably my fault. I could have just thrown it out there, but I figured that that was such a, would be such a bomb in terms of a question. What do you think of Jesus? That it might defuse some of the conversation that was going on there. But I do think one of the things that I found was, and I noticed this during my years of teaching, that there's a rapid decline in biblical literacy and doctrinal literacy. So when I first started teaching, I could know that if I was in a classroom with students had any level of, let's say, an evangelical background, that I could start a Bible verse, right, and they would probably be able to finish it. And then, I noticed after about 3 years, I couldn't do that anymore. It was just moving that quickly. And so even with these folks, when it came down to basic questions, like they'd say, well, my mom was Christian and my dad was Catholic. And I'd say, well, what you mean Protestant? And they would shift their eyes around and have no idea what I mean. No, I mean, just Christian. What? Well, yeah, but which denomination? Well, I don't know. Like what? And so even just the basic idea of a denomination, or which one it might be, was completely foreign to their minds. So my impression was from these nuns was that their understanding of Christianity was so thin that there would be no basis for really having any sort of doctrinal discussion whatsoever. I mean, I hate to say it, but that's my impression, that their Christianity, what they know of Christianity was, that thin.
The question I had is really related very closely to what Father just asked about with regard to Christ. But from a larger standpoint, with regard to what Orthodoxy has to contribute to questions about the hiddenness of God,
Mm-hmm.
how would you react to the suggestion that really where you have to look for the resolution to that is to Christ? Because Christ says, he who has seen me has seen the Father.
Mm-hmm.
How can you say, show us the Father?
Yeah.
The whole tie-in with the Trinitarian nature of the Orthodox faith.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think that would help the
Mm-hmm.
discussion or hinder it with the nuns?
With the nuns, I think ultimately it has to go there, ultimately. But ironically, I think maybe it's not the best place to start. And the reason I would say that is because one of the things that I think you could point to is that obviously you have a contra Nestorius, right? Nestorius wanted to interpret, the fulfillment of seeing of God with the fact that he now has fleshly face, whereas Cyril wanted to be clear that not everybody who had seen Christ's flesh really understood who he was, and that there is an energizing, right, of his flesh, such that in the Transfiguration, that's where there's a real opening of the eyes of the apostles to see what's really there. It's not just that God now has skin, right, or something like that, that it means that we've seen God. So I think one of the challenges that I think is sort of a rhetorical challenge is that there are certain assumptions at work, that if you said, well, God is not hidden because of Jesus, there'll immediately be associations with certain evangelical interpretations of that. And until they really understand how different what's being said is, I'm not sure you can go there, which is one of the reasons I'd be inclined, personally, rhetorically speaking, I'd be inclined to circle around from the other direction of how foreign the picture of the world is so that they can actually accurately see Christ. In other words, my worry would be without them really understanding the sort of what I was calling the porous nature of the world and of creatures and the God-world relationship, that they really wouldn't understand the incarnation properly. And that by starting there without would by starting there, what you might have happen is they actually miss it, right? Because they need to be in some ways disoriented in order to be reintroduced to it properly to see it afresh. If that makes sense.
What was the context when you made that the circle, the
Hmm.
halo?
Yeah.
Was that like an art fair?
Mm.
Did you just go to a neighborhood and do that?
Yeah.
Number one,
Yeah. Uh-huh.
that was really beautiful, and how you, on firsthand, you can see those uh, people out in the streets, and we don't recognize the
Hmm.
image and likeness of God. That's the hiddenness of God,
Hmm.
and we can just see them as maybe thugs or just people out on the street. But when you put that halo, when they just went by that halo,
Hmm.
you just saw the image of Christ in that person.
Hmm.
What were their reaction? Did they see the pictures that you took pictures of? Did
Hmm.
they have any reaction to having that halo around their head
Yeah.
when you took your pictures?
This was a, what we wanted to do is we wanted to find, we were already in Louisville, so that was sort of what set our location, because we'd done filming there already, at St. Michael's there. And then, what we, what we did is we said, well, we want a diverse group, right? And so where's something that's going to attract a lot of people that are very diverse? And we found this sort of hipster part of town that had like this mix of micro distillery, brewing places handing out beers slash art fairs slash you know uh, selling baklava, right? The one gal, she actually gave me baklava, the Greek gal there, who stood in front of it, and it was such a perfect mix of people. And then for myself, in terms of how we got them there, uh, I, this would be again where Josh Lowry was very useful because he just went out there and was like, "Hey, we're doing this thing," and yada yada yada. And before I knew it, I had a line of people. So I never had to go find anybody. I'm standing there with a camera, and there's a massive line of people that I'm slowly working through, trying to do this with. And so I just say, and I think really all Josh did was say, and this is one of the things, just as an aside, I'll talk about this more in the next talk. It's surprising how open people are to weird things like this, things that I would think you'd go, why, what? But Josh would just say, "Oh yeah, we're working on a documentary, and this is one of the scenes where what we want to do is we want to like capture that all humanity is this icon of God, and so all you have to do is like come over here and sign this release form first, and then come over here and stand in front of this, and he's just gonna capture an image of you doing that, and that's kind of it." And they're like, "Oh, cool, sure." This whole host of people, and even you saw the one the whole breakdance crew that we got at one point, and then flagged down a car and started pumping music, so they start dancing, and one of them had a giant snake for some reason, so we're playing with the snake. It just sort of organically evolved, and I don't know how they personally responded to whether that affected them or not. But I do think it was a tremendous picture of um, kindness and warmth towards strangers. I think in a very Christian sort of way, which is one of the reasons that's one of my favorite scenes in the film. I think it captures a lot about what that film is about, and the fact that it intercuts with the nuns. I think it helps capture how I'm trying to treat the nuns throughout the entire film. So.
If we have time for one more question. The question I have is on nuns that you've interacted with,
Mhm.
how often do you see their search for spiritual answers, kind of definitions and realities, go outside of the Christian realm
Mhm.
to Hinduism,
Mhm.
blending of some Eastern mystical kind of realities
Yeah.
into a Christian, kind of creating these
Mhm.
hodgepodge sort of
Yeah.
definitions.
Right. Sort of syncretistic way of
Yeah.
doing things. I think you see it a little bit, but I think when I've seen it, at least when I've seen it, it hasn't been with a great deal of depth. And I don't mean that as an insult. I just mean that to say, well, I explore yoga, right? But I don't really go into the depth of, the history. I don't read the Vedas or anything like that. I go to a yoga, class, and then I kind of like incense, right? And so it becomes this very sort of superficial dabbling with bits and pieces that I like. I like a Buddha statue in my house, but I'm really not a Buddhist. Now, I have seen folks who have been full on, Buddhists, right? And have explored things and then become disillusioned. But in my experience, those are the exception more so than the rule. And I think the reason is partially because of this general view of the betterment of the self and the betterment of the world and things like that. Truthfully, like really, if you if you if you really understand like the Buddhist view of the person, right, or non-person, that's not very conducive to the sort of Americanized understanding of what a happy life really looks like. We're not really too keen on sort of abandoning a sense of me as person. And so so that's where I tend to see it as more of a superficial dabbling of things that I like aesthetically, or things that I like for health purposes, or things that I think are cool, in this way or that way. But not really with too much depth in terms of actual real, I'm going to go to find a Hindu temple or something like that. So. I will say one last thing on that. The more real dabbling happens in the occult. So if you want the real dabbling that steps outside of Christianity, that's where it is. Black magic, the occult.
Hey, everybody. Thanks for watching. Thanks for listening. If you haven't subscribed, please do so. Go ahead and hit that bell if there is a bell, and leave a comment. I hear that's great for the algorithm, and also like it and tell your friends. I really appreciate your support. And until next time.